Last week, we planned to talk more about recent Title IX updates in our next discussion. In the interim, the political environment in the United States has exploded. And it seems we're going to have to put that discussion on hold for a bit. HBR Talk with Hannah Wallen. As we've watched events unfold, what initially looked like localized violent protests responding to a racial incident, the murder of George Floyd by police, began to spread across the United States. Soon, it became apparent that the situation was more complex than that. Police precincts began to report that many of their arrests involved people from outside their local area, even out of state. Videos and images on social media showed black demonstrators and protesters clashing with white, masked vandals, looters, and rioters over their behavior and the concern that the destruction and chaos would be blamed on black people. It's a legitimate concern given that Black Lives Matter protests have not always been peaceful in the past. At the same time, videos and photos began popping up that showed seemingly random stacks of bricks with no apparent legitimate purpose showing up on planned protest routes. There is also video of rioters, quote, discovering brick piles and making quick use of them. Left-wing leadership is blaming the violence on white supremacists, but information from arrests indicates that it was instead, as Attorney General Barr stated this past Sunday, instigated and carried out by Antifa and other similar groups. The appearance of these bricks, whose contributor is unknown, makes it clear that at least some of the violence is not spontaneous, but planned. The rioting has continued throughout the week, with looting and destruction in several major U.S. cities, and similar, if smaller, incidents in others. As townhall.com has reported, the one thing the riots have in common across the U.S. is involvement by Antifa, not Black Lives Matter. While there is and has been unrest associated with the latter group, in the current situation they have been undermined by the violence of the former, using insurgents imported from other areas of the country to locations of obviously pre-planned riots, apparently intended to spark copycat violence among disenfranchised citizens in those locations. In the wake of these reports, the Trump administration has designated Antifa within the U.S. as a domestic terrorist group. This designation is consistent with the definition of domestic terrorism under Title 18 of the United States Code, Chapter 113B, Section 2331. Under that definition, domestic terrorism is described as involving criminal acts occurring primarily within the U.S. that are not committed by a foreign or global terrorist organization, are dangerous to human life, and appear intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. Certainly, looting and rioting as a means of coercing the government into policy changes and the public into supporting that change out of fear of more violence would fit that definition. In a wave of similarly worded articles, left-wing media outlets have scrambled to try to discredit the Trump administration's claims about Antifa's involvement in the riots, citing the disagreement of often unnamed experts, and denying that there is any evidence to back the claims, despite reported arrest patterns, videos, photos, and Antifa's history of violence. This insurgence has also had the most interesting timing. It takes place just as the nation was beginning to learn the details of an apparent silent coup attempt by federal bureaucrats with evidence pointing to involvement by the previous administration. A hell of a scandal was brewing over that, with even current Democrat presidential candidate Biden implicated by some of the evidence that has come out. But nobody is paying attention to that now, are they? And it's just as we were about to see the engines restarted on the nation's economy as officials were allowing more and more businesses to reopen in the wake of beer bug-related shutdowns over the past few months. 2 weeks ago, Americans were told large gatherings would be deadly, and politicians who had opened beaches and some non-essential businesses were defending church attendance and were not panicking over Trump's admonitions that it was time to reopen the country were going to cause widespread infection and death. Now those sentiments have completely disappeared. The only people still talking about the pandemic are those wondering where concerns about it have gone. It almost seems as if we're watching an extremely violent shell game, or maybe an attempt at starting a civil war, and not just an organically evolved manifestation of civil unrest. Whatever the various riots organizers were trying to do, they failed to spark much of anything beyond their own violence, but their actions raise other questions. Namely, how did the United States end up with a social pressure group that blames the whole nation for the actions of individual cops, and a militant group of domestic terrorists with this level of organization and loyalty to a political narrative? The organizations involved, Antifa and Black Lives Matter, are progressive-funded tribalism and unrest aggregators whose goal is not to solve the civil rights issues they claim to address, but to create enough of a societal breakdown to clear the path for a communist takeover. Both groups use the political correctness formula that Soviet defector and former KGB agent Yuri Bezmenov described during the 80s, the use of grievance narratives as a means of manipulating the public. These narratives are used to polarize society, damage family structures, and erode the social cohesiveness of communities by instilling fear and resentment between demographic groups and pitting them against each other over political issues. Black Lives Matter evolved as an organized response to the notion, promoted by social engineers, that black lives are less valued in society and police habitually murder innocent young black men because of the color of their skin. While there are legitimate issues this movement could address, it has been hijacked by progressives bent on twisting its narrative to suit their political agenda. That twisted version of the organization is defended by shaming into silence anyone who questions the original narrative or its evolving agenda, or anyone who tosses neutral data and other evidence into the mix in a way that indicates the issue may be more complicated than Black Lives Matter describes. Antifa just openly promotes straight-up communism, purportedly as a cure for capitalism, which the group has expanded the definition of fascism to include. Loyalists to the cause attempt to shame into silence anyone who questions their goals and their violence, both by using grievance rhetoric straight out of the progressive playbook, and by arguing that anyone who criticizes them must be pro-fascist or a Nazi. The rhetoric of the rioters indicates that decades of grievance politics narratives contributed to widespread protesting in response to this incident, but did that alone trigger the rioters' violence? What makes young people, particularly boys and men, who make up the bulk of arrestees in these conflicts, vulnerable to manipulation and recruitment by these groups? What would attract them to groups whose standards for belonging rely on the same social gatekeeping tactics as a cult? Are grievance politics narratives so contagious that U.S. citizens aren't able to assess what they're being told about their circumstances and who they're being told to blame, fear, or resent? What conditions have primed them to respond this way to such polarized, tribalistic rhetoric? Is it their family and economic environments, with impoverished fatherless homes being so widespread across the country? What can we do as citizens, as family members, mentors, friends, and neighbors to counteract this phenomenon? How does a population insulate its communities against indoctrination, radicalization, and political violence? How does one cure itself of these ills? In light of these events and these questions, this week, HBR Talk will feature investigative journalist Naama Cates, host of the Incel Project, and British Badger Belle Natty Kaddyifa, discussing the issue of young people, especially boys and young men, getting recruited to groups like these and used essentially as soldiers, and how these and other factors may contribute to that phenomenon. The discussion streams on multiple platforms. You can tune in at 7:30 p.m. Eastern via the link in the low bar, or find other viewing and listening options for that time or later on badgerfeed.com.